Thank you very much. So we have a couple of different approaches here. I think I'm going to start off, I may have the less juicier role this morning. I'm going to actually start off in a sense in a survey class. I'm going to run through a bunch of potential policies that are out there. And then Jason B. and Shi-Ling are going to talk about, I think, some of the juicier topics, the juxtaposition of how those policies may relate to one another. We don't have a lot of time, and there are a lot of possibilities out there and policies and measures, so let's jump into it. The construct that I am using in describing this survey of potential carbon-related energy policies is one of least coverage to most coverage, and by that I mean a policy on the least coverage side is one that is very directed. It may only apply to one sector of the economy. Even within that sector of the economy, it may only apply to one aspect. On the other end, the most coverage is the kind of policy that touches, if possible, all sectors of the economy and treats carbon as consistently as possible. Coverage does not necessarily mean success one way or the other, but it's a way that I've set this up so we can sort of start from looking at least coverage to most coverage. The four categories that I sort of discovered is the first one is called Complementary Measures and Policies. This is the most diffuse. This is the most directed, most specific, but can be represent the less coverage and therefore potentially less integrated. Moving along the spectrum, there is a cap, a greenhouse gas cap, a hard cap, a declining cap, and it may apply to a particular sector. Does not have trading with it. I know most of you folks are familiar now, getting more familiar with the cap and trade. There's a concept out there that you do the cap part and the trading part is really hard. So let's do the cap part first. Moving further along the spectrum is the cap and trade. I think the interesting thing about the cap and trade is you still have that hard cap and it declines over time, but the trading element allows you to include other sectors. So you can cover the electricity sector, but you can also include the transportation sector, industrial process, et cetera. And then between those sectors and between geographies, you can trade carbon allowances. And then finally, arguably, the carbon tax gives the greatest coverage of all. I notice that this is getting cut off a little bit, but I'll help you with it. So jumping into it, the complementary measures and policies. This is in the electricity sector. Electricity represents 40% of the anthropogenic carbon emissions in the country. So this is a big deal. And getting your hands around the electricity sector is a big deal. And complementary measures here, by definition, means it's a complement to something else. So these measures are not intended to solve the entire problem, but rather they're directed into certain areas. And your favorite measure may not be listed on here because there are a bunch of great ideas right now. When I started into this 12, 13 years ago, it was pulling teeth to get the powers that be to think about any of these ideas realistically. Now all of these are on the table, and there's a bunch of them. The Renewable Energy Standard, Washington, Oregon, California, 25 states and the District of Columbia have renewable energy standards, and it says a mandate to the utility to deliver a percentage of the energy to its customers has to be renewable. In Oregon, it's by 2025, 25% has to be renewable. The emissions portfolio standard, and the renewable energy standard is limited to renewable energy. It doesn't say anything about what you're going to do with the current coal plant that you have in your portfolio. An emissions portfolio standard, California has one, Washington has one. It says in the future, when you're entering into a long-term contract, you cannot enter into a contract with a resource that has an emissions profile dirtier than that of a modestly efficient gas plant. So it's saying you can't buy any new coal. A feed-in tariff we heard a little bit about today, essentially giving incentives to promote the development and use of renewable energy. Public purposes is a charge on everybody's bill that collects money for energy efficiency and renewable energy. This is an area, for example, where too many cooks could hurt the broth, could spoil the broth, I think. If you see a situation where a state is looking at a renewable energy standard, public purposes, and a feed-in tariff, one could argue that is not the optimal arrangement of policies. Not that they are not all good, but on an optimal sense, having too many piled on top of each other could create extra costs and extra complications. There's new ideas about local bonding authority to provide long-term patient capital for energy efficiency. There's energy performance standards for homes and businesses, so when you sell your house, you get a termite inspection, but you also get an energy inspection so the next person knows what the energy profile of your building is. That should say zero net, not net zero, zero net energy homes, building code, so in 10, 20, 30 years, the building that you live in produces the same amount of energy that you use. There are additional issues in there, additional measures in there. There's the tax credits that we heard about. There's net metering. There's a lot of stuff there. Policies, as separate from measures, there's a bunch of policies that can be adopted, and this may be somewhat of an artificial construct, but the electricity industry is based on a series of public policies that are laudable, but they're 100 years old. They are policies that are based on adequacy. Utilities were told to go out and develop resources adequate to meet their load, to make sure it was reliable, the energy was reliable, and then finally to do it at a reasonable cost. 100 years ago, when these electric utility policies were being developed, obviously carbon was not at the forefront. We are now entering the carbon age. Electric utility regulation needs to begin to understand that as it regulates electric utilities, that has to be a front and center kind of concept. 20 years ago, electric utility adopted integrated resource planning, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But what it's essentially doing is mandating that every couple of years a utility looks 20 years in advance, figures out what load it needs to meet, and then come up with a portfolio of resources that best results in least cost and least risk. And right now, carbon is one of those risks, although the utility commissions that regulate utilities are economic regulators. The risk that they're looking at is not the risk to the coast of Oregon or even the ski industry or the wine industry or health. They're looking at what the cost of a future carbon regulation might have on the end-use customer. So it is, it's still sort of not quite accepting the reality. A couple of the ideas here, and I'm not making any value judgments, so I'm just laying them out. Grant a return on equity that is not blind to the type of resource. We've been blind to the type of resource the utility bills as long as it's adequate and at a reasonable cost. Maybe we shouldn't be blind to that anymore. Maybe we should give rewards or disincentives based on the kind of resource that's being developed. Reduce the risk of recovery for integrated gasification combined cycle, which is the capture and sequestration technology. Whether you think that IGCC is the cure or the curse, that's something for us to figure out as a society. But right now, utilities won't make that investment because it is too risky. Reduce the risk of recovering a coal plant early. If utility shuts down a coal plant early, they may not receive the entire recovery of its investment. And then finally, decoupling profits from losses. A utility makes more money the more it sells. Decoupling, in my opinion, is an imperfect solution to that, but it's getting to the right idea. Beyond the electricity sector, there are complementary measures. If we're looking at plug-in hybrids, at some point we need to begin integrating the transportation sector and the electricity sector. Taking the transportation problem and moving it over to the electricity sector provides some issues there. And so the idea of starting to think about this early and figuring out a way to do it in a most effective way, we ought to start thinking about that real hard. There are separate complementary measures and policies in land use, industrial process, and transportation, forestry, and agriculture. I think we'll probably get to some of those in later panels. One slide, I think, on the cap concept. The reason that this concept is coming out right now is that a lot of people are freaking out about the cap and trade. The cap is not that hard, especially for a couple of sectors. The trade is very hard. The trade is the creation of a new market. When I get to the cap and trade, I'll identify some of those issues, but there are a number of folks who are very nervous about creating new markets. When California created a deregulated wholesale power market in the year 2000, something bad happened. We had an electricity crisis as a result of it. So there are concerns about what happens if hedge funds get involved in the carbon allowance market, a concern that's probably not irrelevant for today. There's also, however, sort of something they don't say, which is that this is the businesses, the emitters, who would have to be in that market. They're also concerned that there may be some nonprofits who raise money and go into those auctions and buy allowances simply to retire them. So you're actually reducing the amount of available allowances, and that is a concern. The cap does work, but it works for one sector in particular. It works for the electricity sector. This is really, this IRP, this integrated resource planning concept I was talking about, it is on IRP on steroids, and for 20 years utilities have been doing this planning. It's not a stretch to say, well, start planning on not just building renewables instead of a coal plant, but on removing and eliminating your coal plants over time. And so the idea that the electricity sector does have not only the experience, but a number of tools to start undoing what they have done over time. And the tools, again, energy efficiency, renewables, you can do a declining cap in the electricity sector. It's a very conceivable thing to do without trading. Whether it works for other sectors, I'm not as sure. Transportation, industrial process, I think the toolbox is much more limited and the experience really isn't there. Cap and trade, now we're starting to expand beyond the electricity sector. WCI, the Western Climate Initiative, that cap and trade design includes the electricity sector, includes industrial process, includes industrial combustion. In the second period of compliance, it includes transportation and residential, commercial, and industrial use of natural gas. So now we're really expanding beyond a particular sector, and we're looking at a broader cut of the economy. There are some sectors it doesn't include. It may not include agriculture, may not include forestry at this point. And here the concept is to set a cap, have it decline over time, and allow for trading in between. So if someone is declining at a faster rate, they have additional allowances. They can trade it to someone who's slower on the ball. More to the point, I think it allows trading between sectors. If one sector has an easier path, they can sell sectors into, or they can sell allowances into a sector that has fewer tools in that toolbox. Trading can happen between sectors. It can happen between geographies. It can happen if you have regional cap and trades, RGGI and WCI. There can be trading between there. There can be trading internationally, and then offsets. There are issues with offsets, but offsets can actually help you essentially have a kind of trading outside of the covered sectors. The cap and trade. This is something that these guys are going to talk about, but I'll just lay it out here. Cap and trade, I think, in the U.S. is sort of in the lead in terms of carbon tax versus cap and trade. Cap and trade is in the lead because it's not a tax. Cap and trade is still extremely complicated, and there are a number of very difficult issues to try to figure out. Cap and trade tends not to be very effective at a state level. Will regional do? Will a patchwork of regional cap and trades do, or does it need to be at a federal level? Who's covered under that regulation? In the RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast, it's just electric generation, As I said earlier, WCI is trying to cover additional sectors. The use of offsets is a matter of controversy. How do they provide additionality? Can you track them? If you're buying offsets from international markets, how reliable are they? The distribution of allowances, do you auction them or are they free? If they're free, are they free on the basis of emissions? Are they free on the basis of load? Depending upon how you answer that, it is huge swings of money from one group to another. This is not an insignificant political discussion. And the market for allowances, started on a Thursday. You can't read that, but it says the market for allowances started on a Thursday. In Reggie, the auction began on a Thursday. There are a lot of things that are going to go wrong in the market that people have thought about. I think there are a lot of things that may go wrong in the market that people haven't thought about. You're creating a new market, and you sort of take the good with the bad. And then finally, the carbon tax, I think arguably this, depending upon how you write the legislation, this is the greatest amount of coverage. I think we can talk about this as the panel progresses. Cap and trade is sometimes ridiculously complicated, and people will say the carbon tax is less complicated and therefore it's easier. If you do this on a U.S. federal level, do a carbon tax, first of all, you got to find the spot at which it changes behavior, how high the tax has to be to start changing behavior. And that number could be very high. What you may need to do is to open up the federal tax code, essentially rewrite it so that if your goal perhaps is to be revenue neutral, you're going to have to rewrite that tax code. That's not a non-complicated process. There will be a fair amount of politics involved with that as well. There's going to be issues here about whether carbon tax works at a regional level or state level or local level as opposed to a federal level. So those probably took too much time. In 20 minutes, there's as many measures as I could fit in. There's more out there. But the good news, I think, is that there are new ideas out there. People are concentrating on the problem. I think the challenge really is going to be to figure out which ones to choose and which ones not to choose, and how to integrate these all together into a policy that really is effective. Thank you.
And we appreciate the applause, but I'm going to ask you to hold it until the end of all the speakers. But Jason was terrific. And now we'll have another Jason.
Do we know how to make that go to the next one? Here.
Okay, as you know, if there's dead air, I'm going to start talking. Jason, I have to thank you for amusing my Fed tax students who were smiling when you were talking about how the tax code was complicated. They don't agree with that at all, do they? No, not at all.
Well, first of all, I want to thank JELL for supporting this, and it's great to see so many people here this morning. I can tell you that for the young lawyers in the room, there are a lot of great opportunities for you in the area of energy law. I hear that the University of Oregon has recently added a class on energy policy, and that's great. I suggest you take it. It'll get you up to speed quickly, I suspect. Also, it's a good way to pay back your student loans after school. Obviously, cap and trade is the topic du jour. I rode up this morning with Jason from Portland, and we had a great discussion, and I learned a lot from this. He's been in this area for a long time and knows a lot about the subject. One thing we talked about was the current credit crunch and its potential effect on implementation of a cap and trade program at the federal level. And I don't know if I agree or not, but he doesn't have much good to say about that. It can't be good for Congress taking the time and energy and, of course, money to invest in something like a cap and trade program, which really is a major undertaking. But getting straight to the point, there are a lot of benefits to a cap and trade program. It's been done before. We know at some level what to do about it. We used it for NOx and SOx in the U.S. It's been used in other countries. And of course, the Kyoto Protocol is up and running. Some people, the Kyoto will show up on the negative side of cap and trade because some people are looking at Kyoto and saying it was a failure or is a failure. I don't think that's accurate. And of course, there is a vast literature of studies and think tanks and ideas and policies out there that have been looking at cap and trade and have hashed out a lot of the ideas associated with that. And I think the consensus is at some level that it is a good mechanism for maximizing coverage and for perhaps at some level minimizing administrative and regulatory costs, especially on a national level or perhaps even international level. There's a lot of talk, of course, we have a potential regional cap and trade program here in the West, 7 states, I believe 2 or 4 Canadian provinces, potentially several states in Mexico, and some additional United States as well. And there is, of course, RGGI on the East Coast, and I believe there's discussion in the Midwest for an additional regional program. And obviously, regional is better than state, national better than regional, and international better than national, as far as I'm concerned. And I think that there are a lot of reasons why we haven't joined up in Kyoto. The current administration obviously has a problem with sacrificing American jobs for the environment, but that's something that perhaps might change in the next few months. And the WCI, I encourage you to take a look at that. It's a great report. You can learn a lot about that program just by reading the report. They explain what they've done and explain why they've done it. It is potentially going to be the most expansive cap and trade program in the country. Obviously, RGGI is fairly limited at this point. I believe the transportation fuels come online in second phase in a few years. But eventually it should cover virtually all sectors of the economy, and that's what we need. Up to about 90% of the greenhouse emissions. We mentioned the Kyoto Protocol earlier. Some folks have denigrated the Kyoto Protocol, and I think that's there's a mix of responses there. One is, well, yeah, it hasn't worked out as well as we hoped that it would. On the other hand, it was, and it was always intended to be, a learning phase in the first phase. We're now moving into the second phase. And I think that there are a lot of great lessons that were learned from there, some that we can use ourselves in the United States as we begin to set up our own programs. I think in 2 or 3 years, you come back and have the same discussion, you'll look at the European trading scheme and say that this was a darn effective program, I hope anyway. I threw the kitchen sink in this presentation, so I'm not going to talk about all this stuff, sort of winging it today to figure out what people wanted to hear about. Obviously, standards are a big issue in cap and trade program. You've got to have transparency in the program so that there's not the sense that companies or sectors are avoiding the law. You could, under WCI, for example, there is an emissions level at which you become subject to the regulations. I believe it was 20,000 metric tons per year. I know better now. So if you fall under that, you're not directly regulated. So what do you do if you're an industry, perhaps, or a company? Perhaps you bifurcate yourself and avoid the regulations. So we've got to avoid things like that. Drawbacks, I think that I've talked with a number of people who, just as a general impression, think that trading in pollution is wrong. It's not an approach that people are comfortable with. I'm not sure that's entirely accurate, since it has been effective in the past. There is, of course, the perception or the reality that a cap and trade program, a regulatory scheme, can be captured by the regulated industries. It obviously has happened before, could happen again, but I think the transparency of the program would be key, and we'd have to be vigilant to ensure that the industries aren't, in fact, avoiding the laws.
Sorry.
It's all right. Of course, the WCI and RGGI are only regional, but like I said, regional is better than state. I think Florida is looking at going it alone. And the issue, I think, that George Bush raised several years ago in refusing to join Kyoto that India and China are not a part of the program. There's some truth in that at some level, but it still doesn't change our obligation to change our behavior. We have been traditionally the greatest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. China has surpassed us recently. I believe last year the consensus is that China now emits more than we do. We can take part of the blame for that, because what have we done? We have exported our manufacturing carbon footprint to China. So we are in part responsible for that increase. Of course, their efforts to improve their standard of living is obviously to blame as well, but that's something that we can deal with as we move forward, but I don't think it affects our obligation to control our own emissions. We already talked about Kyoto. It's not as if carbon tax and cap and trade are either or. You can do both. I believe British Columbia has adopted a carbon tax, and the WCI specifically addresses alternative policies, including a carbon tax. The two can be used together. I think that local jurisdictions could implement a carbon tax. States could implement a carbon tax. It could be at the national level. They're not exclusive, mutually exclusive. And there are a number of aspects of a carbon tax that I think make it a more elegant approach to limiting our emissions. I'm going to leave that for a later discussion. Professor Hsu will talk more about that. And then somebody brought up, I thought, a very well crafted and pointed question concerning feed-in tariffs. And I think this is sort of the crux of my feelings on all of this, is that our approach in dealing with carbon and in climate change in general in the United States has been this sort of scattershot approach. Germany and Spain, some other European countries have employed a feed-in tariff, or what they're now calling alternative renewable tariffs, ARTs, and a more targeted form, a more modern form of the feed-in tariff. And these have been, by many standards, very, very effective to implement policy to promote renewable energy. I think it's true that, as Jason stated earlier, that it can be expensive. But I think that there are many people who agree that, well, that's okay. Pay now, or pay more later. I think is accurate analysis of the situation, and I know that there are a lot of people in the country who are willing to pay more directly right now to get to renewable energy, as opposed to setting up this smorgasbord of incentives to promote renewable energy. It's sort of a around-the-corner approach to doing it. I can tell you as a lawyer, I don't mind so much. If you want to pay me to syndicate your Betsy's or monetize your PTCs or some other such arcane thing, I'm happy to do it for a couple $100 an hour. But I think that at some level, that approach, that American approach, has a number of problems, and Jason discussed at the end of his presentation the fact that we've got to look at this smorgasbord of policies and try to figure out which ones are necessary, which ones are redundant, which ones are simply have low benefit for cost. And we haven't really done that. Right now, we're still throwing as many things as we can at it. Let's just pass that out. I lost track of time completely. Probably
you're
talk.
fine.
All right, great.
Got another 7 minutes.
Great. There are, luckily for us, there are a number of really bright, motivated people out there who are doing their best to come up with good, vetted ideas to address climate change. One of those is the Apollo Alliance. I am a fan of the Apollo Alliance because I think they've taken the correct approach of not approaching this directly at renewable energy, but rather trying to encompass the whole economy and what they're doing. Apollo Alliance is an alliance of business leaders, of environmentalists, and labor. Thank goodness that we've got labor in on this, because as we move forward, Secretary Bradbury was discussing the growth in the economy in Oregon, and I think he's right on. We've got to put all this together and present it as a whole package. And I think that's the most effective way to sell what is essentially a new energy paradigm to the public and to business and to industry. There is no question in my mind that the approach that we're taking is in part due to the fact that, for example, I think there's something like 215 investor-owned utilities in the country providing about 75% of the power, and these are large for-profit organizations. They're not community-owned, citizen-owned utilities. They're there to make a profit, and all of this scares the bejesus out of them. And they are very reluctant to make these changes. And as Jason indicated, we've been doing the same thing for about 100 years. And this represents a fundamental paradigm shift in how we produce energy in this country, and I think it goes further than that. It also changes how it is that we operate as a country and as an economy. And I think the potential down the road is phenomenal, especially if we focus on the connection between the green economy and green energy. I don't think you can do one without the other. At first, I thought that you could focus exclusively on renewable energy, and whatever other side benefits occur, well, that's great. But no, I don't think that anymore. I think the two have to go hand in hand. Just to give an idea of how many, you can't see that, can you? Oh, yes, you can, it's the green. How many great policy ideas are out there. This comes from a book, report that Paulo Alliance put out called New Energy for States, Energy-Saving Policies for Governors and Legislators, and law students and business people and other people as well, obviously. Just in this area, sun, wind, and bio-based, well, let me just go through. These are the great, well-vetted ideas that exist out there just from one group's one publication. I'm just going to, can I go up and down with this, by the way?
Go back. Oh.
Yes, good. So that was page one. I'm going to go briefly through some of these. But you see, these are all great ideas that are out there. These things exist. They're implemented elsewhere. I'm going to go back to the first one. So sun, wind, bio-based, that's where the I think rubber meets the mat. We have a variety of policies that are available. We mentioned net metering a bit earlier. I think it's just one more example of sort of an around-the-corner approach to promoting renewable energy. Net metering in the state of Oregon has been increased to 2 megawatts, which is admirable, but it's still intended to promote development of renewable energy on-site for use on-site, not to be put back on the grid. By the way, net metering is if you generate power on-site through a renewable energy facility, you can essentially send your power onto the grid, and your meter will run backwards, and you're essentially banking your energy for use down the road. However, at the end of the year, if you have a surplus, you lose it. Decoupling is an approach that Jason talked about earlier. We have done it in the state of Oregon for natural gas, which basically is an approach, policy approach to sever the relationship between the quantity of power sold and the utility's profit. If you're not decoupled, then the utility has no incentive whatsoever to conserve, to take efficiency measures or to promote efficiency in the community. As a citizen of Portland, I now get flyers from Northwest Natural regularly. Hey, buy a 93% high efficiency furnace, we'll give you money back. You're not going to see that generally in a non-decoupled state. Renewable portfolio standard we have here, 25 by 25. Renewable fuel standard as well. By the way, anything in green means that the state of Oregon has adopted it, or something close to it. And I suspect there's a few in here that I've missed. I don't want to talk about all of these. I'm probably just about out of time. But you can see that there are a number of excellent policies out there. Efficiency measures, I think, are the low-hanging fruit. And I think they've been neglected. It's like the law student that knows every single thing about one limb of information. We've run up on that tree as far as we can go. Meanwhile, we left all the low-hanging apples in the tree. Efficiency is the cheapest form of energy production. The kilowatt you don't buy is the cheapest one you ever will buy. There are so many opportunities for efficiency improvements in industry, in our homes, at the state level. The possibilities are virtually endless, but we've taken advantage of very few of them, and as a policy, I think is where we start. I live in a 1926 home, and I realized recently that it has no insulation in it, and apparently they didn't start putting them in until the 80s, and that's back when energy was cheap, and when we didn't have an energy policy. By the way, I wanted to read something. You guys probably recognize this nutshell from energy law. Although Congress requires the President to submit to it a biennial national energy plan, it is fair to say that the United States has no coherent and comprehensive plan. Still, as a general proposition, since the late 19th century, the United States has developed an identifiable pattern of energy decision-making. And that pattern is simply the continued supply of cheap energy. And that's how we've done business for 100 years. I think that when the next edition of this book comes out, I hope that they won't be able to say that anymore, because we've got to have a coherent national policy that's integrated with state policies as well, the laboratories that have been out doing things like implementing WCI, and that we will have an energy policy that uses efficiency as a starting point, moves into renewable energy and expands the economy in such a way to bring in manufacturing jobs, green living wage jobs that will fundamentally change and alter the way we do business in the country. There's a host I invite you to check out. This is all online for free. For Apollo Alliance has these reports, and you can learn a lot by just reading a few of them. I want to finish up, like I said, these are the other publications from Apollo Alliance, so there's a lot of opportunities there. I want to finish up with a call to action. These are all the things we've already done, by the way, in the state of Oregon. So we've taken a lot of steps as a state. We are one of the leaders in the country, and our economy, to a certain extent, reflects that, as Secretary Bradbury mentioned earlier. A call to action. I can't pass up an opportunity to sit in front of a bunch of people who are interested in this without asking you to get busy and participate. There's a lot of great opportunities out there for the lawyers, for the new lawyers and law students. You can make a living, you can contribute, and enjoy yourself, and hopefully make a bunch of money. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. I'm going to turn it over to Shi-Ling now.
Yeah.
And in case you hadn't picked up on this, Shi-Ling is from the University of British Columbia, so he's going to give us a bit of an international perspective on these issues.
Well, thanks, Roberta. Thanks to JELL for putting this on, and thanks for having me here. I want to do two things with my talk. One is to review the law and policy in Canada of renewable energy, and secondly, to talk a little bit about a carbon tax, as Jason have predicted I would do. That being my favorite prescription for an energy and an environmental tax. The title of my talk is... Microphone?
I think we may be taping, so it's probably...
Okay. The title of my talk is Renewable Energy Policy in Canada. And if you're the kind of person that pays attention to what the name of a font is, you know the name of that font is Comic Sans, MS. And I chose that font for that particular reason. It's not necessarily true that energy policy in Canada is so much more hilarious than it is in the United States. But you know, we're a funny country. We produce John Candy, Mike Myers, John Kerry, Jim Carrey, Bob and Doug McKenzie. So, you know, when things go wrong, there's more of a national inclination to laugh a little bit and kind of move on. And, you know, that's refreshing in some ways, but in some ways it's bad. When things have gone wrong, like they have gone wrong with energy policy in Canada, no one gets mad. There's no one like John Benign in Canada. 30 million people, no one's getting mad about what we're doing wrong on a national or provincial level. There is one important difference. For the most part, Canadian energy policy and American energy policy look fairly similar, but there's one important difference, and that is that the Canadian Constitution actually lists powers that are allocated to the provincial and the federal government. So it actually says the provincial government shall have the legislative authority to do this, 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 and this. And one of the enumerated provincial powers is energy. So in Canada, there can be no federal energy regulatory commission like there is in the United States. And this has had profound consequences for the energy industry in Canada because, as you can imagine, the provinces are not only able to, but they are mandated by the Constitution to develop their own energy policies, and working with each other to try and coordinate things like energy exports and imports. I mean, some provinces have a very, very small population. Prince Edward Island has a couple of 100,000 people. It's really hard to do. That is one lingering problem with Canadian energy policy. That said, there's some logic to this strong federalism, and that is that every province has a variety or has their own energy sources. British Columbia, where I live, has an abundance of water. We generate 90% of our electricity through hydro. Same for Manitoba and Quebec. Alberta has a bunch of coal and natural gas, so they generate a lot of their, 90% of their energy through fossil fuels, and a little bit through wind and hydro. Ontario, for reasons that I still don't quite understand, is highly dependent upon nuclear energy, and they're about to be more dependent upon nuclear energy. I actually think they probably just decided politically as a province they didn't want dirty coal because they have air pollution problems of their own, and I think they've been fairly aggressive about trying to solve them. Because of this strong kind of provincial authority to regulate energy, federal energy policy is basically about giving out money. The conservative government, the current ruling government at the federal level, instituted a program called EcoEnergy in 2007, and this is just a late-coming mimicking of the production energy, renewable energy production tax credit that you have in the United States that it seems to be in danger of expiring if Congress doesn't act.
We're good, we're good.
You're good?
Yeah, they tacked it onto the bailout bill.
Oh.
Yeah, giant package. Whoop, just stuck it right in the
Wonderful
bailout bill and whoop. So
Okay.
last week, we're good.
All right, so we're still funnier than you are. That's good. We don't get as much. A penny per kilowatt hour, and that's a Canadian penny, for 10 years. And it's sold, it came into effect in 2007, and it's sold as kind of a one-shot deal, so these projects have to be online by 2011. Who knows? At some point, the federal government may renew it for another 10 years, but the current government isn't saying that. Electricity has to be for sale in Canada. I never understand why these provisions are in. I don't know how you can tell one electron from another, but I guess for those people that want a made in Canada, sold in Canada approach, I guess you can sort of fool them with something like that. Registered projects under the EcoEnergy program have focused mostly on wind and hydroelectricity. Wind is the big winner. You might be a little bit surprised because you think Canada has a lot of water. You'd think a lot of these projects would be hydro. Well, the reason that hydro has had a smaller uptake is because Canada's already developed a lot of hydroelectric power. 60% of Canadian energy comes from hydro. So, there's been some additional uptake on hydro. I guess the one troubling thing is that you kind of wonder if Canada has developed its hydroelectric resources so thoroughly, why did 58 projects with 1,419 megawatts of capacity actually come online under the EcoEnergy Project? Turns out a lot of those hydro projects weren't built because of environmental and Aboriginal concerns. So, I don't want to be too critical of EcoEnergy. On the whole, it seems to be a good thing, but let's not think of it as an unalloyed good. In terms of, if you break it down by province, the EcoEnergy Project has developed a lot of projects in Ontario, some in British Columbia, and in terms of capacity, British Columbia and Alberta seem to be the biggest winners. It's a little misleading that 2,912 megawatts in British Columbia is largely due to a single geothermal plant being built just outside of Whistler. It's the only geothermal plant, by the way, registered under the EcoEnergy Project, which brings me to a criticism of the EcoEnergy Project and of this kind of approach generally. It's just that, when you subsidize certain technologies, there's a propensity to overlook other winning technologies. And I don't know a lot about geothermal energy, but it seems to be a very cheap, abundant source of energy with a base loading capacity. And I know there are some plants in California, but I suspect because of a certain bias towards wind and hydro and these more familiar technologies, geothermal gets a bit of a short shrift. Anyway, that's, there is, in addition to the EcoEnergy program, some tax incentives, and I won't spend a lot of time on this. If you know tax, this is probably boring, and if you don't know tax, this might be boring too. There are a bunch of, you love it? Okay, I'll spend a little bit of time about it, just to keep our moderator engaged. There are some tax incentives that are offered to renewable energies, but again, late coming, and really these incentives are just to create a level playing field between renewable energy and the fossil fuels industries. These tax benefits, these accelerated depreciation benefits, were always available to the robust oil and gas industry in Canada. And so what the current government merely did was to extend these to renewable energies. And we spend a fair amount of money. $1 billion in Canada is a fair amount of money. And about $1 billion in these subsidies were offered in 2000, 2001, and 2002. Some things that the renewable energy sector gets that the oil and gas industry does not get is the ability under the CRCE, the Canadian Renewable and Conservation Expense Program, to deduct expenses for things like feasibility studies. So if you want to see if a particular site is a good site for a hydroelectric dam, then you can actually deduct the cost of that. Service connection costs as well. You can try and do a study to figure out how well your renewable energy can connect up to the grid. Flow-through share agreements are a way of allowing a tax benefit from these kinds of tax incentives to flow through to the investor or the taxpayer, so that they can enjoy, you can more easily attract investors. So that's what there is of federal energy policy. It's not a lot. I thought I'd look at provincial policy by looking at the two provinces that have some form of a renewable energy policy, and that would be British Columbia and Ontario. There's not a lot in terms of renewable energy policy at the provincial level. If you're a federalist and you were hoping to argue that, look what great things the provinces do if the federal government only stays out of it, the provinces really haven't vindicated themselves and aren't going to help your argument in that way. BC has some kind of an energy plan. There's something called the Clean Power Call. All of these were formulated as part of the province's 2007 plan. This is a call for proposals for clean energy. You have another 3 weeks to get your proposal in, and you've got to have it in service in 2016. So again, this looks like kind of a one-off deal. There's a standard buy-offer program, a reasonably generous program to buy electricity and make the regulated electricity monopoly in BC Hydro, buy that energy from you. And the subsidy is pretty sizable, 7 cents to about 8.5 cents a kilowatt hour, but it has to be for small projects. And what's all the rage right now in BC are run-of-the-river dams, where they try to not disrupt the flow of the river and just divert the water a little bit, generate some electricity, and send it back to the river. There's a bioenergy initiative. There's just $25 million, and that's almost a rural aid program, because what they're trying to do is buy trees that are rotting away from the pine beetle infestation and use that to burn to generate electricity. Ontario has a similar set of incentives. They have a more generous buy-offer program. Again, small renewable projects. They're paying 11 cents a kilowatt hour. And 14.5 cents if you have base loading capacity. They unfortunately don't have a lot of geothermal resources, so not a lot of people take advantage of the 14.5 cent kilowatt hour credit, tax credit. And 42 cents a kilowatt hour for solar, and the sun doesn't shine that much in Toronto too, so even given that very generous benefit, not a lot of firms have been taking advantage of that tax credit. A variety of retail sales taxes, breaks, income tax deductions at the provincial level. These are all, modest incentives to invest in renewable energy. I guess if you look at provincial energy, you don't have much reason to be inspired. What I personally wish that some provincial or federal government would do is to actually think about energy and the environment together. I was actually in Beijing about 6 months ago, and they're drafting an energy and environmental law together. That's amazing for those of us who think that, China's a developing country and their legal system isn't very developed. They're doing what no developed country there might be one or two in the European Union that are doing something like this, is actually thinking of energy and environment in one piece of legislation. So when they do an environmental assessment, they do an energy assessment, and vice versa. And we don't see that a lot. That would be a good thing for us to do in North America, but failing that, I'm going to spend the rest of my, 7 or 8 minutes or so, talking about what I would argue for, and that is a carbon tax. Lots of smarter people than I are arguing for a carbon tax. This is Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, who was President Clinton's chief economic advisor for a couple of years. Like me, a New Yorker, like me, a Dodgers fan, like me, an economist, not like me, very smart and a Nobel laureate. But here he is arguing for a carbon tax in 2006, arguing that this is the only way we can get global buy-in, all right? So we can talk about cap and trade, but to Stiglitz anyway, he makes a complicated argument that I can't really reproduce, that the developing world will never trust us unless we impose some sort of a cost, however modest of a cost, and a carbon tax is the way to do it. On the other end of the spectrum is George W. Bush's chief economic advisor for 2 years, Gregory Mankiw, talking about how you need to have a carbon tax because that's kind of the most economically efficient way to do it. And he, along the way, kind of throws out some other people from various sides of the political spectrum that favor a carbon tax. Bill Nordhaus was an economist who worked in the Clinton administration as well. And there's some pretty conservative people who favor a carbon tax as well. I guess Alan Greenspan's endorsement doesn't count for as much anymore, but Martin Feldstein was a Reagan administration advisor, Gary Becker, another Nobel laureate, a real good conservative libertarian. But these are all people calling for a carbon tax. Why? I'll leave some of the carbon tax argument to Professor Mann in our afternoon session, but essentially, there's a saying that government is bad at picking winners and losers are good at picking governments. And if you think about what you have to do to design a cap and trade program, it becomes apparent that a lot of people will have their hand in designing that program. Once you get a lot of people involved in having their say in how you should allocate permits, how many permits you can allocate, it becomes a vehicle for political shenanigans. By contrast, if you think about a carbon tax, it's actually kind of hard to say, well, the carbon tax shouldn't apply to us. One industry that's going to be really hard hit by a carbon tax is the trucking industry. And they're going to say, our average life expectancy is 55 years. It's hard enough to being a trucker. You've got to give us an exemption. But then what do? You give them an exemption, or are you going to give, who else are you going to give an exemption? So in effect, the slippery slope argument is so intractable that I actually think a carbon tax is a way to keep political shenanigans out of the process. I actually, Jason made an argument about carbon tax being complicated. It actually isn't quite as complicated as you might think. We do have, as Jason Busch pointed out, carbon taxes in Canada. Quebec actually instituted the first carbon tax in North America, except for Boulder, Colorado. I'm not counting cities. But Quebec is a big province, has a lot of people. They instituted a carbon tax in 2007. It wasn't very much. It amounted to about 1 cent per liter of gas paying at the pump. We have a slightly more ambitious carbon tax, about $10 a ton, which amounts to 2.5 cents a liter, phasing upwards over 5 years to about 3 times the amount. So 7.5 cents a liter isn't a lot. It's about, that would turn out to be about 30 cents per gallon in U.S. terms. And hasn't been that hard to do. One thing that does make it politically easier is that British Columbia has introduced, well, no, they didn't think of this, has made their carbon tax revenue neutral. And that is to say the province is giving the money back in all sorts of ways. We got a $100 check in the mail for being a resident of BC and putting up with the fact that we have a carbon tax. Lots of personal and corporate income tax breaks. People think and they are largely but not completely right that a carbon tax and a gasoline tax is regressive. And so a lot of the carbon tax proceeds are going to things like rural aid and low-income aid, again, to try and address the somewhat ambiguous signal that carbon taxes are regressive. But anyway, BC's trying to address that, and politically, that's not a bad thing to do. We're having our own federal election in just a couple of days, and a carbon tax was proposed by one of the major parties, and that's become a real central part of the campaign. The federal Liberal Party, which is actually the centrist party, is the one proposing the carbon tax, and they've gotten in, frankly, a lot of trouble for it. The leader can't even call it a carbon tax. He calls it a green shift because he's using the carbon tax proceeds to fund other things. To get back to the point about this is actually not that hard to do, we're not a big province. We have 4 million people, less than Oregon, I think, in a province 1.5 size the times of Texas. And we figured this out. This wasn't actually too hard at all. There are only about, I think I counted this up, about 14 fossil fuels that account for just about all of the carbon dioxide emissions from the burning of fossil fuels. And just about every one of them is sold in a fairly regulated market transaction. That is to say, there's a paper trail that follows the sale of everything on that list. Maybe not butane, but everything you sell, somebody in the government knows you're selling it. So it's not that hard to levy a carbon tax. And this carbon tax is fairly modest. Professor Bonneville scolded me when I would criticize this carbon tax as being too modest. From acorns, mighty oaks grow. And he's right, this carbon tax is a beginning. It's the first major carbon tax in North America. And it does increase over 5 years, that on the left-hand column. And if you're paying at the pump, like I said, it's about 7.2 cents per liter. And so this hasn't turned out to be too bad. It's trivial to collect gasoline tax, and it hasn't been in the 3 months that we've had it a big deal to collect the taxes. I was going to talk a little bit about the politics of the carbon tax in British Columbia. I'll just kind of give you this little bit of animation. This is the Liberal Party leader who proposed the carbon tax, or the green shift, and he had some revenue neutral programs. But from the left came the left-leaning New Democratic Party leader, Jack Layton, saying those advocating a carbon tax suggest that making the cost for certain things are more expensive. People will make different choices, but Canada's cold. Heating your home isn't really a choice. I'm sorry, I believe that we should address income inequalities, but we can't hold climate change hostage to this sort of thing, and that's what Jack Layton is doing. And we do have choices. We can make choices. As Jason pointed out, no insulation in his house. That's something that we can do. The government can help you do it. We can turn down the thermostat. We can drive less. Canadians can do that. From the right is our current Prime Minister. The National Energy Program was designed to screw the West. This refers to something that happened in the 1980s that created a war between Alberta and the federal government. But this is different. It will actually screw everybody across the country. At least, I have to say, a little more truth in that than what Jack Layton is saying. Carbon taxes will cost money, and somehow I think there's a psyche that we can actually get away with solving climate change without actually having to pay. We actually are going to all have to pay, and we might as well face up to it. I just wanted to underscore the kind of the good humor of our country and how people, I think, we got to being a more polluting place than the United States through a variety of things, but part of it is our easygoingness. I'm actually an American, but I've been here for 5 years, so I'm a Canadian now. But I guess the lesson I think that we might learn from experiences past is that we can get a little bit excited, maybe a little bit exercised and angry about energy policy in Canada, and maybe finally get to work on instituting a carbon tax.
Yay.
So, anyway.
Okay. Thank all our speakers. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions, and we see if we have questions from the audience. Yeah.
I have question about the carbon tax, and I guess this is open to anybody. As for cigarette taxes in the U.S., as those became to fund more social programs and health programs, governments began to rely on them. There's an economic argument that the governments actually need those cigarette taxes now. They need people to smoke to fund these social programs because nothing else is. Do you worry that a similar situation will be reached with carbon taxing, that it'll start funding things and then nothing else is funding those, so we actually need polluters?
That's a great question. I hope not. The thing is about a carbon tax is that if it works, those revenues will dry up. Because if it works, that means people are actually going to stop doing those polluting things. They're going to actually turn down the thermostat, produce less. So maybe that's a reason that the carbon tax in BC has been relatively modest, because the revenues have been fairly modest, so they haven't had to rely on that yet.
I actually think that's an argument for making it revenue neutral and recycling the revenue from the carbon tax to make it less regressive. So, for example, if the carbon tax is impacting on lower income people because they spend more of their income on transportation and heating and whatnot, implementing the carbon tax will make those sectors more efficient, and therefore it will no longer be regressive. So the revenues theoretically should not be needed if it all works according to plan.
And if I may, it also obviously depends on the inelasticity of the demand. Cigarettes are cigarettes, right? I'm not going to give up because they cost $4 a pack. Energy usage, on the other hand, most certainly is more elastic. And I think that set at the appropriate level, demand would go down.
Okay, yeah, question in the back there.
I'm unabashedly passionate about feed-in tariffs, as Jason knows. And so I'm happy to see it appearing in several places, but I'm a little confused about the response being that it's expensive, because every study I've seen shows that it's the least expensive way to produce a lot of renewable energy fast. And the only reason you set the price that people are going to pay for, the ratepayers are going to pay for renewables at a profitable rate. But we're going to have to set it at a profitable rate some way, whether it's through the BETC, through a tax credit, or however you do it. But studies are showing that the least expensive way to get there is through a feed-in tariff. And the only way I can see that we might be saying it's more expensive is because we're developing more wind, and solar is going to be expensive to produce. And if we're going to start getting solar energy into the Oregon electricity system, we're going to have to pay for it somehow. And feed-in tariffs seem to be, according to every study, the cheapest way to get there. And if there's numbers out there that are showing that it's too expensive for Oregon, I'd like to see them.
When you first define what a feed-in tariff is,
Okay, why don't we let the Jasons
I
take
think
this?
Jen doing it is fine.
You want to have Jen do it? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Then go ahead.
Well, a feed-in tariff, what we have here in Oregon and what we have in somewhere like Great Britain is we've set a percentage of electricity that our utilities have to produce from renewable sources. A feed-in tariff takes a different approach and sets a price that we're going to pay for anybody who wants to produce electricity from qualified renewable sources, but we pay a certain price. And that price is set as something that's profitable, but not a windfall. So there's going to be a different price for solar. Ontario was on its way to getting there, but didn't quite get there. You have to get a price for solar has to be about 75% to make it actually profitable. And Ontario is going back and trying to do it better right now. So the idea is that your utility has to buy any qualified electricity that you produce. And so the idea is also making it something that we can all be producing the electricity that goes through the system.
So the feed-in tariff, again, I mean, I tend to think that a feed-in tariff plus our renewable portfolio standard plus systems benefits charge is beginning to pile on and creating some inefficiencies in the amount of money that it's all costing. So that is a legitimate issue, and it's probably, I think all three of us suggest that it's time to really step back and take an integrated approach at energy policy and figure out which ones that work. In the meantime, Oregon, half the states have renewable portfolio standards, and the theory was a little different. And you're right, it sort of ends up in a particular place. The theory was mandate that the utility provide a certain percentage of renewables to its customers, and within that mandate, there's going to be competition, a price competition, for theoretically the lowest cost renewables to meet that to meet that standard, and so therefore you're sort of encouraging competition and efficiencies through that process. Whereas the feed-in tariff relies a little bit more on somebody figuring out what the appropriate tariff is. And there's sort of this command and control versus market kind of force thing. So I think the one that works is the best one, and the RPS has got a head start in this country, and the bad thing I suppose about the RPS versus the feed-in tariff, I think Jen is correct, is that in the competition to get the least cost renewable into the system under an RPS, you got a lot of wind. And unless you have a carve-out under the RPS for other technologies, solar and geothermal, at this point in their technology curve, they can't compete with wind. And so you end up with a lot of wind. And so I think Jen is right. If the feed-in tariff looks more expensive, it's because there's more solar in there, and solar is more expensive. So there are different ways to go. I think the appropriate thing is to take a step back and figure out what is the most effective. And effective, I suppose, means both effective at reducing greenhouse gases, but also cost effectiveness, because ultimately, in my defense, I said that a carbon tax is complicated, not because of the economics there. I think it's relatively easy to assess it. It's the politics behind it. And if a measure can be defined as not successful in two ways. One is it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, and it doesn't reduce greenhouse gas. It's also not successful if the people after a year or two can't stand it anymore, and they rush and take it off the books, or they make changes to it. So feed-in tariff came in sort of later, I suppose. I don't think there's anything internally that is inferior about it. It's more of a timing issue.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about how you would deal with imbalances that result from electric power cost increases and other kinds of cost increases related to these various schemes if the whole world doesn't go with the scheme. If you're dealing with British Columbia or Oregon or Canada or the United States, and you put yourself at a trade disadvantage, how do you deal with that issue? A couple of things that occur to me is that you can give a rebate, like Europe does with the VAT, when you export the product, and you can add the tax on, or add a cost on in the form of a tax on an import. What are the other things you can do in order to deal with this? And then what stimulates this is Oregon does well, partly because our electricity costs are low. If you add the feed-in, all of a sudden we lose our advantage. How do you fix that?
You go ahead, start.
One, I'm not a trade expert, but I do understand that if one were to levy an import tax, this is an international issue, it might not necessarily answer the Oregon question or the BC question. The answer to BC is that it's not so much of a carbon tax, that it actually affects competitiveness. There are two cement manufacturers in BC that are screaming bloody murder about it, and I don't know what to do. The government's probably going to give them something, just a one-off payment. But at the international level, you could make the argument that you could levy a border tax adjustment on the theory that cement manufactured in China, not subject to a carbon tax, is a different product than one manufactured in Canada and the United States. And that would kind of recreate the trade imbalance, the competitiveness imbalance anyway.
Just real quickly, I don't know what the answer is, but the issue comes up all the time. You mentioned the carbon tax at a state level, and people will go bananas and say, well, I'm moving across the border. Even a cap and trade on a regional level, who's in and who's out makes a lot of it's going to make a big difference. The WCI proposal is going to go in front of the Oregon legislature this year, and one of the political points that's going to be made over and over again is if Oregon is in, we'll be less competitive vis-a-vis Idaho and Montana, who won't be in, and internationally. I think that the unsatisfactory answer may well be that on a individual sector by sector approach, and there's one cement manufacturer in Oregon, so that sector is one entity. They get a special deal. I mean, that's the way, that's politics, and it's ugly, but short of that, I don't know what the policy answer is.
And let me just, one extra thought on that. Maybe turn that around 180 degrees and think about what a carbon tax or a cap and trade does to an economy. We have cheap energy in Oregon just by virtue of our water. But I can tell you that as population growth continues in the Northwest, cheap energy, as we know it, is going to go away. From a business perspective, if you can account for your energy costs in the long term and factor that into your business plan, you are in a much better position than if you are subject to the waves of energy increases and decreases that go on all the time. And as we move forward, the volatility, I think, of the energy market is just going to go up. And if you're buying energy from a company that has entered into a 20-year power purchase agreement with a wind farm, where the set price of the energy is written down on a piece of paper with a percentage increase per year or every 5 years or whatever the case may be, you know exactly how much your energy is going to cost, and you can plan for the long term.
Okay, I want to wrap this up and thank our
Can I
panel.
want to publicly apologize? I didn't mean to say you said that. I just wanted to make the point about a carbon tax actually being relatively simple, but I didn't mean to suggest that he was wrong. I was right.
Okay, terrific. I think this has been very thoughtful. There are obviously a lot of issues still on the table, and some of which will be discussed in future panels.